On behalf of our department of architecture and engineering, and myself and the staff and our students, we would like to welcome you here in Palestine. And I'm so happy to present to you Stuart Whipps. He's a lecturer at Birmingham University, right? And he teaches art and design and sometimes architecture. So there's this interdisciplinarity in his work. He's interested in photography, and also I've read that you're interested in the post-war townships now. Yes, right? Okay, and we'll continue. The floor is all yours now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I can cause mayhem with this projector being there, so anytime anyone moves that. Firstly, I want to thank you for welcoming me, because I've only been here for 2 days, but I've been made to feel very welcome. It's been a real pleasure to meet both the staff but the students also and hear about your work. There are some experts in the room about some of the things that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a library in Birmingham, so I'm intimidated. There are some people who know more about that than I do. So I teach at Birmingham City University. I work as an artist in different parts of the world, but I think all of the work I show today is going to be about things in the UK. It's going to be about, I wanted to talk about this intersection between what I do as an artist in response to buildings and architecture. Not all of it, but majority of it. The other sense of this, I'm going to talk about materials and objects. See if this works. This is our first time I've tried to do this. I'm controlling the... I know, it's fancy. So the first thing I'm talking about is directly related to architecture, although it doesn't look like it at all. And this is a very primitive form of language, of sign language. It was developed by Sir Christopher Wren. Can anybody tell me the famous building that Christopher Wren built in the UK? Anyone? My students in the UK wouldn't answer this either. St Paul's Cathedral, but most of London. So Christopher Wren rebuilt London after the Great Fire in 1666. Yes, that is the correct thing. But before he trained as an architect, when he was still a student at Oxford University, he developed this sign language that was for people who either couldn't speak or couldn't hear. And what it does is different to sign language that we use now. It uses the digits on the left and right hand to create letters. I'm going to bring some spray for the door. It's going to be my gift to you. This is the engineering building. There shouldn't be any squeaky doors. Yeah, sure. Anyway, so this is how it works. I'm going to show you very quickly. So the letters, all the possible letters are on the left hand, and then you choose which one by the right hand. So A, B, C, D, and E would be on the thumb. F, G, H, I, J, and so on and so on. So if I want A, it would be the thumb, and then A, or B, or C, D, E. Are you with me? I mean, it gets more complicated as you do it. But anyway, so this that we see now is the letter K. As we go through, this is an X. And the colours are, the whole thing was colour-coded as a way of teaching people how to use this language. So that's how I've kind of used it. But this is the important part. So this is how I use it. So this uses 2 analog slide projectors. So it uses 35mm film. So I photographed all of these hands using analog photography. And then I work with an engineer who has designed a control system for these projectors. That means the combination of fingers that gets produced with the slides is completely random. So I have no way of predicting which letters will be produced. And that's what the piece of work is. And the title is called A System for Communicating with the Ghost of Sir Christopher Wren. So I use this as a way of trying to communicate from beyond the grave with, Christopher Wren's ghost. So the letters are produced, and then I sit and I watch them with this, and then I make screen prints of all of the letters. So far he's not said anything to me. But that's, what's gone wrong? Hold on. Let me, I knew this would happen. This is what happens when you try and work with dead people. Oh, I've gone back. Hold on. Let me pause. Is this going to work?
I can move it from here.
Yeah, maybe I'll have to do that. I think I'm going to... Oh, I'm back up. Let's try it one more time. I'm back up.
Yeah.
Okay, and if not, I'll just have to start giving you the nod. I'm really pleased with the turn. So why do I want to do this? Why am I interested in trying to resurrect dead architects? All of the work that I make, it always starts with something existing, so some kind of historic precedent. So I spend a lot of time researching in archives and collections, and I'm interested in how I might respond to historic information, artifacts or objects. So this is a tower in England on the south coast called Peterson's Folly. So it was a tower that wasn't really built for any kind of purpose, although it was intended to be a mausoleum for the guy who built it when he died. But the important thing to say, so the man who built it, his name was Andrew Thomas Turton Peterson. And I know, you don't have to remember that. There won't be questions at the end of this. But he was a big believer in spiritualism. He's, and in the later part of the 19th century, early 20th century, when he retired, so he was a barrister in India. When he retired, he became interested in spiritualism, and he believed, this is from a newspaper that was published in 1895, I think it was, called The Medium and Daybreak, where he talks about the fact that the ghost of Sir Christopher Wren visited him and gave him the information he needed to build his tower. So essentially that tower that we saw in the last image was built by the ghost of Christopher Wren, according to Peterson. In addition to that, I'm interested in this guy, who is another builder or architect. It's a guy called Clough Williams Ellis. Again, you don't have to remember these names, but I wish to give you all of the information. And this is a cartoon from a different publication in which it's when he arrives in heaven and he's having a conversation with the ghost of Sir Christopher Wren, also kind of discussing architecture and actually apologising for himself for being a poor architect. So this is the thing within my research, and these are disconnected projects really in terms of the starting point, but I kept coming across these references of people who were citing the ghost of Christopher Wren. So that's why I built this kind of device that uses photography as a way to try and communicate with him. The fact that it uses photographic materials is important to me, because I think there's something about still, even in the kind of digital age, and even though photography has never been believable, I think it does carry a weight of evidence or authenticity. So I'm still interested in trading on that in a way, of doing things that aren't believable, like it's not believable for me to talk with a ghost, but somehow the apparatus and the materials, I think they give it a level of kind of seriousness or authenticity. There's another example as well where the same guy is using the ghost of Christopher Wren to talk about the Blitz. But anyway, so resurrection is really important in terms of my work. Here are the experts now to tell me about this building. So this in a way is a more direct example for me of something dying and how you might kind of bring something back to life. So who can tell me the name of this building? Well, there's two buildings. So this is a unique time. So this is Birmingham Central Library, And this is the brand new Library of Birmingham, built by Meccanoe, opened in 2013. This one was designed by...
John Meadham.
Indeed. This feels so good for me. Can you tell me when it opened?
18 something. 18, no, 72. No.
74. 1974. Very close, by Harold Wilson. That's fine, we won't get into that. This is what it looks like from when it was there, from the back, and a work that I made. So when that process that I was just talking about of them knocking the old library down to build a new one, when that was happening, I, alongside 3 other photographers, were commissioned to make some work about this process. And the thing that I was asked to focus on was the old library, the 1970s brutalist concrete library of Birmingham, which I think is very interesting. Well, I say was a very interesting building architecturally. But I also wanted to find a way to kind of communicate what I thought was happening to this, that wasn't just a case of photographing the building. So, and bear with me, so I photographed instead 364 boxes that were contained. I'm not going to show you all 364, it's fine. I did joke that this lecture was 6 hours long, but it's not. It might seem it. 364 boxes that were contained in the basement of Birmingham Central Library. The thing that's important about them is that they contained the archive of John Maidin's architectural practice. So this was the architect who designed and built the library, and his archive was in the basement of that very same library. But as you can see, it wasn't an archive that was cared for. So the boxes were in a state of real disrepair, they were broken, and in fact they weren't even formally, I keep picking this bit, I'm going to move it. They were not even officially part of the collection. So they were storing them, but you couldn't, if you were a visitor to the archive or the library, you couldn't ask to see anything that was in them. There was no list for them, there was nothing like that. So for me, this became an irresistible metaphor for the treatment of the building. The fact that the architect's own archive was also in this building in a state of disrepair talked of the lack of care, the lack of value, not just in this building, but in that kind of architecture of that time period. And it was more interesting for me to photograph the boxes than it was to photograph the building itself. Although that said, the way that I was able to do this is that I volunteered my time as a kind of like an amateur conservator, somebody who would kind of clean these things up. So after I'd photographed all of them, I had to clean them, and I also made a list of all of the data that was on the outside of them as a way that I could get time to make the work that I wanted. And in the process of doing that, of course, I started to look inside them and find information that was interesting to me. So this I think is really nice in relation to the presentation that we had yesterday, and I'll say why in a moment. This is a box from 1964, it says libraries, and this contains all of the research information that John Maidin accumulated as he was preparing to design his library. And that resonates really nicely because you were then looking at this library as a case study for the thing that you're going to do, and here we have the precursors to that. So inside, for instance, this is, what is this? It is a diagram of the structuring of the Detroit Public Library that was inside the box we just saw. So that was one of the places that he went to. He also went to the Arts and Architecture building at Yale, designed by, we've got a room with a lot of architects in here. Anyone?
Yeah.
Paul Rudolph, famous architect who taught at Yale also. And there were letters to Rudolph in this box also. But so what I did is I made the same journey that John Maidin did. So this is a photograph of the Arts and Architecture building at Yale. I talked about this building yesterday to, where is it? What's it called?
Like model facade.
Yeah, sure.
But I forgot its name.
You're saying the right things. It's the Beinecke, it's a difficult thing to remember as well, the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, also at Yale. The interesting thing, so this is a postcard of that building that I found inside the box. This is a photograph of the building after I visited it. So I talked about architectural folly earlier when I was talking about the tower that doesn't really have a purpose. I'm also interested in ideas of folly within the work that I make. But what can I ever really hope to learn by revisiting these sites? You know, that is there even much there, or is that a folly in and of itself? Yeah, the important thing about this building is that the marble is 1.25 inches thick, which allows light to permeate through the material. So it illuminates the space, but it doesn't damage the books that are contained within it. The other thing about that is, for me, it resonates really strongly with photographic materials and slide film. So this is how the work was presented. The projection isn't... Yeah, there we go, we can actually see the space now. So this was an exhibition at Icon Gallery in 2011/12. This is a gallery in Birmingham. And you can see that these images were presented about 3 meters by 3 meters. They were all, again, all of them were photographed on photographic slide film and were projected directly back out using that film. So very kind of direct relationship. There are a few things about that that are important to me, and the reason why I work that way is, I guess, as you enter the gallery and you have this image that's kind of monumental, and there's a real kind of crispness to it when you shoot on film in this way. I wanted the images to have a kind of value and a preciousness as images that the objects don't have. You know, the objects are not looked after and are not valued. I wanted the images to kind of speak of something else, speak of a kind of value. That the fact for somebody to, well, you could say 2 things. You could say that somebody taking the time to photograph all 364 of these boxes suggests that they're important, or you could suggest that I'm an idiot. I prefer the first version, of course. The other thing that's important about using slide projectors for me in this way, so there were 3 of them in the space, is that you can set up connections between multiple images, which again has a fidelity to me of the process of flicking through archives, that you find things next to each other that were never intended to be that way. And also it becomes very architectural as you activate the space by showing these buildings as well. And you have the viewers kind of move around as the images are changing. Okay. You'll also see that titles are really important to me. So this one, Why Contribute to the Spread of Ugliness? It comes from just a little leaflet for a company that made tiles that I found in one of the boxes. But for me, spoke more broadly about the activity that was going on here. That there was for me, there was an ugliness in this process, which, as you picked up on yesterday, the most important thing to say about the building of this new library and the demolition of the old one is it also marks the transition of land from public ownership to private ownership, which I think is an ugly situation. Okay. So I'm going to start by showing you some pictures of a building, but this work really isn't about architecture at all, but it does kind of function in a way that some of the other things that I've already started to talk to you about do. Is it takes a historic moment and tries to kind of make sense of it. It uses photography and other objects and items in which to do this. So this is a factory also in Birmingham. So I make a lot of work about the place where I live. I've lived there forever. I do work in places all over the world, but I also make a lot of work about Birmingham, about this place. So this is where it's a car factory. They used to make Rovers, Austins, British Leyland was the kind of key name for it when it was a nationalised British industry. So at the peak there were 22,000 people working in this one factory. It closed in 2005 and I had access to, in fact I've been making work about this place since 2004. I'm still making work about it now. That's okay. You you have to give the talk. So since 2004, I'm still making work about it. Lots of my family historically have worked in the motor industry. So my brother now still works for Land Rover. My grandfather on my mother's side worked for Jaguar. My grandfather on my dad's side worked for here. So it's an important part of my family history, and actually lots of people who live where I live, it's the same for them. Lots of them have worked in these factories. So I wanted to document these spaces before anything happened to them. And in fact, this is one of the first photographs I made. This one was 6 months after production had stopped. So everything had just been kind of left where it was. During the process of making these photographs, a Chinese manufacturer bought all of the machinery and also bought the rights to use the names, and then moved all of this to Nanjing in China, just on the Yangtze River. So as part of this process, I then went to China. So even though I'm saying these things are about Birmingham, they're really about kind of globalized industries as well, and trying to kind of understand these processes. So yes, so I went out to China. I also started to make photographs of the workers. I rarely photograph people, sometimes their hands, but not often portraits in this sense. I guess it's something I've always struggled with. I come from a very working class family in Birmingham, and the history of photography, certainly, I think the history of photography around the world in terms of documentary practice, I think has often been people from one class photographing people from another class, and kind of in a highly subjective way. It's always been difficult for me to kind of rationalise. And in a way, the thing that, or maybe this is worse, maybe it's better, I don't know, but the complete lack of connection I had when working in China, in that I couldn't speak the language and that the people I was photographing didn't speak English, made it an easier process for me in a way of, I could never think that I was photographing a person, which sounds dehumanizing. I don't mean it that way, but perhaps it does. Perhaps that's what's happening too. But for me, this person became metaphorical in the same way that the boxes were. You know, it's kind of standing in for a process that's taking place. I mean, that got. Do you mind giving me the? Okay. So this is how these photographs were presented. And this goes back to 2008 that this exhibition took place. Very straightforward presentation of photographs, just kind of framed, 2 different sizes, almost as you would kind of encounter them if you were looking through a photography book, you know, where the walls kind of become the pages. The thing about that is there was something quite dissatisfying for me about that presentation, and about what I was trying to do was really to try and tell a story that's incredibly complicated. The closure of a factory in 2005, the loss of 6,500 jobs at that point. I think it's very difficult to try and communicate that through a series of photographs. I think whilst the photographs look good, you know, it's almost impossible to go into an environment like that and not take kind of nicely composed photographs. So what I started to do was do some research into a specific moment that I thought might help me understand what was happening. So this is what I did. I presented some alternative works alongside the photographs. So I decided that I would look into the time period of 1979. So it's a really important year in terms of British industrial history. So it was there was a strike here yesterday, is that right? And tomorrow also, is that right? So 1979 in the UK was the peak year for strike action. So since then it's kind of hugely declined. And there's been moments before, but that was a time when there were the most amount of days lost to people being on strike. 1979 also marked the election of Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of Britain. And those events are linked because she started effectively a war on the unions and crushed the power that the unions had. 1979 is also the year that I was born. So I thought it was this neat way of kind of taking a specific time period to try and understand this complex event that happened much later in 2005. So I started to collect materials from that time that might say something about it. So yeah, minis were made at that factory. Does anyone in this room know who Ronald Biggs is? I'm not surprised. He was a famous criminal. So he was part of what was called the Great Train Robbery, which happened in the 1970s. And he famously escaped from prison. So this was an advert. Nips in and out, might be what you talk about with a car, but Ronald Biggs nipping in and out of prison. This is also from, I should say, the magazine is of an adult nature. And I was interested in collecting material from lots of different sources, which I'll show as we kind of go through there. So this is an official photograph from the British Leyland archive, also from 1979. This is from the Communist Party of Great Britain. This is from the Socialist Worker Party, all from the same time period. And then finally, and most importantly, this is from a British sitcom called Fawlty Towers. Is anyone familiar with Fawlty Towers in the room? I mean, I didn't expect you would be. These aren't things that necessarily would travel. So it's a comedy that was on British television in the 70s and 80s. And the thing about it is the main character at this point, he's going on this kind of rant about workers at this factory in which I'm making work. So he's talking about them being lazy, he's talking about them lounging around on conveyor belts, stuffing themselves with his money. And this was something broadcast on national television. The important thing about all of this is that I feel that even though we have something that feels trivial, you know, it's something from the something from television, we have things from adult magazines, we have things from the official archives. That's the important thing to me, that it's about actually something that's on TV at prime time on a comedy show. I think is probably more important than something that's contained within the official archives in terms of how we might understand not just how ideology, how an ideology might be, but actually how it's shaped. That this is just as important as what Margaret Thatcher was doing as the Prime Minister of the country. So that first bit of work that I showed you, of the major, minor, trivial key, the numbers, it's like 4,862 major words. That was an analysis that I conducted of Margaret Thatcher's speeches, interviews and statements from 1979, and I used the categorisation system of the Thatcher archive to work out whether it was major, minor, trivial or key. Because for me it's a way of understanding the photographs that I've made, of you need to know about this episode, to then understand how the photographs might function. But in a way, it still doesn't feel enough. It still doesn't feel like I'm really getting to grips with this complicated situation. So I wanted to take this investigation further. So this is me, lying on a cold floor. This is a Mini that was built in 1979. And this is a guy called Keith Woodfield, who's 82 years old, who worked at the factory for 35 years, and he's working with me to restore this car. So what I did to try and understand this situation further is I bought a car that was produced from the factory at that time. So in a way, this comes out of that complicated time. And now what I'm doing is, this should have been finished nearly 2 years ago. It's still not finished. As the car gets stronger, I get weaker. I feel that this is happening. Not fans of cars. It's fine, it's fine. So what I'm doing is I'm doing the restoration with workers from the factory. So this is a way to access different kinds of information. So it's that thing, as an artist, you can say, put calls out to say, I'm working on this project, you know, it's an art project, would you like to get involved? And you will always get people who do want to get involved, but people who just wouldn't, you know, they're not interested in art, it's not part of their life, it's not something they think about. And someone like Keith, for instance, would not get involved in an art project in that way, but now he is because it's positioned in a different way. It's like, would you come and work with me to help me restore this car? And then we talk about what Keith did at the factory, what he thinks of this time, and the same with other people that I'm working with. So it becomes a way to try and better understand this situation through this process. But also, this is what it looked like before I started taking it apart. So also, but the materials themselves, and some of you mentioned yesterday that I kept talking about materials, and that's true, because I think it's something that's very important, that the materials, not just the form, can also communicate things to us. So I think there's something interesting about the fact that this comes out of this, as I say, this tumultuous time, this complex situation, and that maybe the evidence of that is within the materials themselves. Or in the same way that, I guess there's a resonates with that process I was talking about with the sign language. That's not really true. We won't really find evidence in the material, you know, there won't be things scratched into it or things in that nature. But I think when you start to present it in this way, it makes people think about it differently. When you know that this car was touched by those same hands at that time, it just makes us consider this as differently. And the photographs I've been making are these almost forensic kind of photographs that in great detail show the kind of the rust and the degradation. And again, it's not to say that this exists because people were on strike, but it just makes us think about that situation differently, knowing that these things coexisted. And if we just click again. The other thing I'm doing is making these little videos of the processes. I'll just leave Keith for a little while.
Well, jiggle now, no?
This video lasts for 1 hour, but I'm not going to show them everything. Then you would know how to take an engine apart. This was very surprising to me that hitting it with a hammer is part of what's required. I got control back. Let's see how long it lasts. The other thing I've been doing is conducting, again, sort of, in a way more boring, research, but actually essential. So these are diary notes from a guy called Mr. Savage who worked at the factory at that time. And the other thing I've been doing is collecting newspapers, also from 1979, that have cartoons that relate to the factory in some way. And then I've been making these photographs of bits and engine parts on top of them. So this is a really important one. I mean, you will be more versed with the kind of, uses of propaganda than I will be, think about how things are kind of portrayed in the media. These are workers from the factory shown as pigs, who are demanding more money. What this says on their armbands is poor taxpayer, and they're filling up the trough with cash. So this is the national press. In unison, both left and right sides of the national press were against the workers. In a way, this represents the first battle of neoliberalism, I think, in the UK, that was happening at this factory, that went on to kind of, they essentially crushed the power of the unions, and used that as a springboard to take on much bigger unions, such as the National Coal Mining Union. That's led to kind of profound effects. In fact, I think the vote for the UK to leave the European Union also has its origins in some of these things that I'm talking about 40 years previously. And I'm kind of interested in just starting to think about that as a 40-year cycle, and working with some economists and some other people to kind of really think about those ideas and tease that out. But alongside that, I'm also doing kind of, I guess, sort of what you consider to be lighter research of the period. So I've been researching all of the colours that were produced and making photographs of bits of the cars against this colour. So, and in fact, this is the colour that my Mini will be when it's restored. So that's quite a long-term project that I've been, since 2004. I like to work on lots of things at the same time. And some of them seem quite connected, and some of them seem very disconnected. But actually what happens is I think they start to weave together as the work progresses. So this is a much more recent exhibition that happened also in the UK, in a city called Bristol. And it's an exhibition called Isle of Slingers. Is there anything I've shown so far? I guess some of the earliest work that I showed is in here, like so the sign language becomes part of this work, but also that idea of, if we think about that tower, that folly, really what this exhibition is about is what we build, what we construct also within the landscape, and why, and who does it. It also includes part of Birmingham Central Library. I'm always interested in it. So this wall that you see here, this is when they were demolishing the library before that started. I got access to the building and removed about 800 of these bricks to store in my studio to then use in lots of different ways. So I remake them as a kind of, almost as a monument to this building that's no longer there. Actually, the title of the work is An Unsuccessful Proposal for the Library of Birmingham. Because what I actually proposed is that they were moved to the new library and would actually have clad one of the walls. The reason I wanted to do that, do you remember in that image I showed, there's a gold bit on top of the new library, and you guys who are experts in the library know about this. Do you know what's inside it?
The archive.
Sort of. It's the Shakespeare Memorial Room. Yeah, so it's all of material about William Shakespeare. The interesting thing about it is that room actually is from the 19th century Library of Birmingham, and it was taken apart piece by piece. It was moved to the 1970s Central Library. It was then taken apart piece by piece and put on the roof of the new Library of Birmingham. So I made this proposal that these bricks should be the same. That this should be an important part and a legacy of this little bit of 20th century modernism that's now gone to Birmingham. It was turned down. So, but I kind of like that better now, so I use them in lots of different ways. I've used them physically in different configurations in shows, and I've also used them as a backdrop to a film, which I'm going to show you shortly. The other key part of the exhibition is this exploration of natural materials. So these are pieces of Portland stone, photographs that I made. Portland stone is used extensively for the construction of monuments. It was used for the construction of St Paul's Cathedral and lots of London, going back to the Christopher Wren reference. And I guess that's why I'm interested in the idea of it as a kind of monumental material. So they were printed, these are 2 meters long, these photographic strips, so they take on quite a large scale. The batten system that they're displayed on is also something that I've been developing as this colour-coded system in which to display these layered photographs that exist in exhibitions. So I kind of want to reference, not necessarily like a, if we think about something like the Tate Museum, I don't want that. I want something that's more like a smaller regional kind of museum display system. And something like, for instance, that last image that we showed of the Portland stone, I like to think that if you were to open a museum on this little place of Portland, this is the kind of system that they might use. So it's this much more humble way of kind of displaying the work. But really the most important part of this exhibition was a film that I'm going to show you a short bit of. As you came into the main part of the gallery, it is also important to me that you were presented with the constructed rear side of the screen. This was 5 meters by 4 meters. This is what it looked like from the front, so this was the projection. And this was a dancer that I worked with. It's not me. He's much more handsome. His name's William Bracewell. He's a dancer for the Royal Ballet in London. But I'm going to just show you a bit of the film, and that will make more sense.
I. S. I is for Isle of Slingers. We begin with the story of Jocelyn Pearson and the book in which he appears, Thomas Hardy's 1897 novel, The Wellbeloved. The novel is set on the Isle of Slingers, which Hardy describes as the towering rock, the unity of the whole island as a solid and single block of limestone 4 miles long, standing unique and white against the tinted sea. The sun flashes on infinitely stratified walls of oolite, the melancholy ruins of cancelled cycles. The Isle of Slingers is acknowledged to be the small Dorset island of Portland, famous for Portland stone. Pearson is a sculptor, the son of a quarryman. As he searches for the perfection of womanhood, he bears more than a passing resemblance to the figure of Pygmalion from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Repelled by the Propoetides, the female inhabitants of Cyprus, Pygmalion carves a lifelike ivory statue of a beautiful woman, lovelier than woman born, with which he inevitably falls in love. S is for septarian nodules. The British Regional Geology series for Portland indicates that the ringstead waxy clays, which are virtually at the top of the corallian beds of the upper Jurassic strata, comprise about 5 meters of clay, with thin seams of clay ironstone that are nodular in places. It seems very possible that this septarian nodule, which is on display in the Portland Museum, is from this source. P. P is for Portland stone. More of Portland has been carried away than remains on the island. Portland building stone is obtained from the limestones of the Portland Formation, which occurs near the top of the Jurassic series. The structural geology of the island is extremely simple. The whole island forms part of the southern limb of an asymmetrical anticline with an east to west axis, which in company with the majority of anticlines with east-west axis in the south of England, has a steeply dipping northern limb and a gently dipping southern limb. S. S is for slate. Slate is a fine-grained, foliated, metamorphic rock that is created by the alteration of shale or mudstone by low-grade regional metamorphism. It is popular for a wide variety of uses, such as roofing, flooring and flagging, because of its durability and attractive appearance.
Okay. It goes on. I won't play it all. But just to kind of say what's going on there, so again, using photographic materials, so it's an analog slide projector, projecting the image that doesn't render on that surface, and then the stones are rearranged each time to be able to make the images that are projected. And in a way, William kind of stands in for me as somebody who's trying to make sense of these disparate materials. So the way that the film starts and what you hear there are these kind of quite boring, you know, and purposely so, descriptions of the materials of Portland stone, of slate, of shale. But then it goes on to also talk about these kind of stories connected with the materials. The stories of people who extract them, you know, who are the people who mine these materials, and the stories of the remains. Actually, we were talking about the remains of material. What do we do with quarries when they're done? What do we do with the kind of heaps of waste material? That's one of the driving forces behind that work. So there is a place in Wales, in the UK, which used to mine slate for roofs, you know, for tiles. And when that process had ceased, the town was surrounded by the waste of that, these big grey kind of piles of waste slate. So they drew up a national park in the 1950s. You know what I mean by a national park? So like, yeah, designated as a place of natural beauty. Although this town is right in the middle of this national park, it was deemed to not be beautiful enough to be part of it. So even now, if you look on Google Maps at a map of Snowdonia National Park in Wales, there is a hole in the middle. And the hole is this town of Blaenau-Ffestiniog, where the slate comes from, because it's deemed to be not beautiful enough to be part of the national park. So this judgment that's applied because of the materials that surround it and the waste, I think is really important and a really interesting thing to think about. Because in relation to that, in opposition, there is a place in Scotland where they mine shale, where they also have the same huge tips of waste that surround it. But instead of being excluded, it's actually those waste tips are called monuments. They're part of the historic monuments of Scotland. They haven't done anything to them, they haven't built anything on them. They just see them as a monument to the industry that created them and to the people who worked on them. So those value judgments about materials are really important to my work. I'm going to stop by showing this last film. It's only about 2 minutes long. This is, as Dean was saying, I'm interested in new cities that have been built in the UK. So in 1946, after the Second World War, the New Towns Act was drawn up that talked about building these new cities. Milton Keynes was the last one to be built. In fact, it's just celebrated its 50th anniversary. Has anyone heard of it? Milton Keynes? It's a famous new town, maybe in Milton Keynes, but not so much outside. No, it is. In fact, people do travel around the world to see this place. It's one of the last and most significant new towns built in the UK. We have a huge housing shortage. They should be building many more, but they're not. Anyway, what I did is, this is a short film that shows public artworks that were commissioned for Milton Keynes, alongside cartoons from the newspaper of the Milton Keynes Development Corporation. Why would I do such a thing? I guess I'm interested that these things were driven by a utopian ideal to try and build new cities that would be better than anything that had gone before them, and were very open and expressive about trying to build utopian places. This was the language that was used. But what I found when I started to read these newspapers, which were not published outside, they were just for people who were working on the building of the new town, is that they were sexist, racist, all of these things. So I think there's a really nice dichotomy that exists between the outward expression of the public artworks and then the inward expression of the people who were actually there building them. I'm going to stop talking. The dog is just asleep.
I hope so.
Don't worry. Note the grey, depressing weather. I thought that I was coming away for something better than
Bye.